Cristian Eduardo is an advocate, speaker, and educator for anti-human trafficking initiatives and immigrant and LGBTQ+ rights. He is a survivor of international and domestic sex and labor trafficking, a Mexican immigrant, HIV positive, and a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and someone who speaks openly about mental health challenges he has faced that frequently result from trauma. Although these are just parts of him, and he is whole and cannot be defined. Cristian Eduardo is also a student who is a science and engineering oriented major. Cristian Eduardo's inspiration for his social justice work is to give insight that victims always remain human beings. Cristian is a lead human trafficking consultant and survivor with Shobana Powell Consulting, shaping national human trafficking training and policies. He also serves on as a survivor consultant for ECPAT USA, Center for Court Innovation, and USCRI. He is the co-founder of the United Immigrants of New York, a coalition of immigration advocates providing accessible education and resources to Spanish-speaking immigrants in New York. Cristian is on the steering committee for the New Yorkers for the Equality Model and Louisiana for Survivors Justice Coalition. And he has been instrumental in the development of the Equality Model training and legislation across the U.S. Gregg, it says is a lived experience expert, social worker, and community organizer for anti-human trafficking, mental health, harm reduction, and LGBTQ initiatives. Kylie has developed an anti-trafficking curriculum and clinical assessments for healthcare systems, schools, and community organizations. Kylie is a mental health crisis social worker with a CARF accreditation for behavioral health care providers. Kylie approaches her anti-human trafficking work through a survivor-centered, research-based, radical feminist lens. Kylie is based in Ohio and enjoys spending her free time with her two cats, Spider and Gorlami. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
So welcome, thank you so much for being today with us. Actually, I'm very excited that we're talking about this. I think that a lot is happening on legislation around the United States, specifically around laws around prostitution, how this intersects with legislation around human trafficking. So I think that it's very, very important that we understand what is the equality model, the evidence base, show why it's working, why is the best approach, and also understanding that this is very supported by survivors. So let's just start going. So first, I just want to do a content warning because we're going to be talking about prostitution, sex and sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, and this can be a reminder of people that you have been working with. If you are a survivor yourself, this can reminder your experiences. Even if you not openly identify as a survivor, this can also be triggering. So just remind you that we really care about you. If you feel triggered, if you feel that this is too much, feel free to stand up, get out of the room, get a sip of water, breathe, whatever your body needs, to really stay present and remember that you are in control. We are doing this presentation, but also we really care about you. We know that working in the trafficking field is not easy, so we just want to remind you that we are all human beings, and regardless how long we have been working in the field, sometimes this work can be triggering. So today we're going to be covering about what is prostitution and human trafficking, the core elements of it, their intersectionalities, the legal models to address prostitution, the impact of full criminalization, the impact of full decriminalization and legalization, what is the equality model, and specifically we are going to have a case example about New York State legislation because we are trying in New York State to implement on a state level equality model. And after we're going to have Q&A, so hopefully we'll have at the end 15 minutes, so please write your questions at the end, so we are going to try to answer them the best possible. Am I missing something or something that you refer?
Yeah, I just want to add that as you heard in our introductions, Christian and I will be approaching these legislative models and specifically focusing on the equality model, both from our perspectives as lived experienced experts, as survivors of trafficking, and then also as our from also the lens as professionals in the social services field, in legislation, in harm reduction. So throughout this presentation, you will hear both perspectives of the research-based, what these laws actually look like when they're in action, and then also our lived experience and how that contributes to our feelings towards each version of legislation. So this presentation will be a mix of both of those things.
Perfect. Kelly, I know that we have an introduction, but something else that you would like to add or share about yourself?
No, I don't. I think Teresa did a wonderful job. Thank you, Teresa.
Perfect. On my part, I just want to add that it's very important, that even if we are an anti-trafficking organization, we need to keep intersectionality at the core. One of the main things that I'm always advocating is like, oh well, I'm seeing in this room like as part of the attendees only 2 males. That's kind of a red flag for me. Like, why we don't have more males? Why we don't have black people, immigrants, other people from marginalized and vulnerable communities? That's really a goal for me, because if we are going to do anti-trafficking work, that means that we are going to fight also against homophobia, transphobia, racism, and all the other forms of abuse and violence that we have been perpetuating. So it's just a call, like, to really think about, like, if we really are anti-trafficking organizations, we also need to care about all these other social justice issues. So,
add to,
sure.
Just while LGBT status is arguably less visible than some of those other things that Christian mentioned, based on all of the wonderful people that we've met, I think Christian and myself make up of like half of the LGBT people in this room. So that's important as well, in addition to the other identities that you shared.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start. We are just going super quick about prostitution and human trafficking. A lot of times when I hear people talking about prostitution and human trafficking, people separate prostitution and human trafficking. Human trafficking is one separated thing, and prostitution is another thing. The reality is that not. Prostitution is the environment where sex trafficking is happening, and it's not only sex trafficking. It's sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, all these systems of oppression, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and in reality, like, prostitution is really driven by the demand. The people who are who want to access people's body because they have the privilege or the financial stability, like to use their money to buy people. That's the reality of prostitution. It's not really because we as human beings, we are like, oh, I want to sell my body just because I wake up one day and I'm like, oh, because this is going to be very happy and very funny. I think that is one of the big myths, that you can enter prostitution, be happy that everything is going to be fine. The reality is that no. There are lifetime consequences. The reality is that a lot of times we survivors, we have been living through it, and we are going to have all these consequences until the last day that we are here. And some of them are it can be mental health, it can be like physical consequences, health consequences. So just keep that in mind. I think I'm talking about this is that one of the main things that I hear when we suspect that someone is in prostitution is or in sex trade is like, oh, they are there because they deserve it, because they want it, instead of having the approach of like, oh, how can I best support these people regardless how they identify. Because sadly, we don't have any tool that just by seeing someone, we cannot recognize if they are trafficked or not. One other thing is that survivors of human trafficking, when we were exploited, we weren't able to identify trafficking, and the coercive control is one of the main parts of sex trafficking. So a lot of times people in prostitution, it's going to be extremely hard to recognize that they are sex trafficking survivors. And a lot of times we need to change that, because if we can only serve those people who identify as survivors, we are missing a lot of people. Most of the time, people on the sex trade, and when I refer to sex trade, I'm really talking about prostitution. They are there because they are not other choices. Because a lot of times we're immigrants, we don't speak Spanish, we don't speak English, we don't have a legal status because we are LGBTQ plus and we don't have a safe space, we don't have a family at home, we don't have even food, a place to stay, we don't have love, we don't have acceptance. And these are components that drive people to enter in the sex trade. Why? Because the sex trade is the only place where we are not going to be discriminated, when people are not going to attack us, and actually like where people seem and use like these elements against us and be like, well, I value you, I value your body, I value who you are, but the reality is that you're part of the coercive control. So the three main elements of prostitution and sex trafficking is the sex buyers, that we know that they are the ones who have the money, they are the ones committing like the abuse, regardless if they know the people who is being bought and sold are survivors or not. The reality is that they don't care, and I can say that it's not only my story, but the hundreds of stories that I have heard, going from I really don't care if you are less than 18 years old, I really don't care if you're an immigrant, I really don't care if you're doing this willingly, I really don't care. The only thing that I care about is that I'm paying and you're going to do whatever I'm asking you to do. And that's the reality. And they don't care about how you identify, they don't care about politics, they don't care about like if you're a survivor of human trafficking or not, and that's the reality. Sex buyers are doing this willingly. A lot of times they are going to communities where they know that poverty exists, that they know where the LGBTQ plus youth that are homeless, experiencing homelessness going, and they are actively like going and looking for all these people. So it's very important to understand that. Most of the time that we talk about sex trafficking, I think that we say, oh yes, demand reduction and all these things, but we really don't name it. And a lot of times we hear even in our communities, in our circles, like people saying, especially like, oh, let's get some chicks, and as kind of a joke, and we don't call it out. So I think that it's very important because I think that we all know sex buyers, and we need to start calling them out. They are not helping our communities, actually they are exploiting our communities. The second part is the traffickers, the exploiters, and the brothel owners. There are the ones who are recruiting, there are the ones who are using like a facade, like to allow the buying of human beings. And the last part is the people being unsold. Why I use this term, people being bought and sold? Because that's the reality. Like we are not seen as human beings. We are seen as a commodity. We are seen as things just to satisfy sexual pleasure. That's the reality. Like prostitution is not about empowering. Prostitution is not about identity. Prostitution, it's about power and control. And those who have the power and the control are the sex buyers, the traffickers, the exploiters, and the brothel owners. And in reality, a lot of people who are in the sex trade or in prostitution, they don't want to be there, but they don't have opportunities. Something else that you like to?
Yeah, so as Christian stated, the equality model rests upon the understanding that prostitution and trafficking are not separate issues, as they are often considered to be. And one of the clearest ways to really demonstrate that is to look at the demographics of people who are involved in the sex industry in any capacity. So we see that the vast majority of people who are being prostituted, who are being sold for sex, are women and girls. We see that prostituted women are diagnosed and suffer from PTSD on levels equal or similarly comparable to people who have been tortured and like active duty veterans. We see that 65 to 95% of prostituted women were sexually assaulted or abused as children. We see that 75% of them, if not more, were homeless at some point in their lives, if not currently. And we see numbers that state that 85 to 95% of prostituted women wish to leave the industry, do not wish to be selling sex, but see no way out or see that they have no other way to survive, to feed their children, to access the things that they need. We also see that the average age of entry into prostitution for prostituted women is pretty notably below the age of 18. We also see that pimps or traffickers and johns and sex buyers are very overwhelmingly men who are middle-aged and who are middle class to well-off, who are married, have families, have regular jobs. They're not the sketchy guy on the corner that you want to believe that they are. They are people in your community and in your neighborhood, just as the victims and the survivors are. So looking at that paints a more clear picture of the lack of distinction between prostitution and trafficking. It also sheds some light about myths on trafficking as a whole, which is if you believe that in order to be a trafficking victim, somebody must be held in actual literal chains or held, at literal gunpoint, well then the vast majority of victims of trafficking would not fall into that definition. So we have to have a complete and robust understanding of victims as whole people with whole lives and all the different ways that somebody can be manipulated into this sort of situation. We also need to have a more clear understanding of consent, which is that consent is largely, at this point, defined to be openly, freely given without any sort of pressure, coercion, or manipulation. By that definition, no sex which occurs in prostitution under the coercion of money, under the coercion of if you don't have sex with these men, your children will not have food tomorrow. If you don't have sex with men, you will end up into a situation in which you are withdrawing from a drug that you are addicted to, or you will end up in a situation in which you have no shelter. Under that understanding, we realize that no sex in prostitution can ever be consensual, and that all sex that occurs in prostitution is rape and is trafficking. Further, we see that when you are more willing to remove that distinction, you're more willing to help different types of victims, such as LGBT people, people of color, people living in poverty, people who are suffering from substance use disorders, who may be stigmatized in a way that does not allow them to recognize themselves as victims. We also see that pimps and traffickers and sex buyers will often use, you're not a victim, this is not abuse, you enjoy this, you chose to do this, you choose to show up at this hotel. They use those tactics to convince victims that they are not victims, and then they don't reach out for help. And we, as people who care about trafficking as an issue, need to do everything we can to combat that, which means erasing our preconceived notions of trafficking and prostitution as separate issues.
Yes, and it's very important that we see prostitution really as an iceberg. The reality is that what we see on the streets, a lot of times what we hear on news, what we see on magazines, it's just the tip of the iceberg. That's the reality. It's very interesting for me that especially when we talk about prostitution, we don't talk about all the cases where sex buyers are engaging the people who are being sold on drugs, getting arms, or if you go deeper and deeper, you start seeing that prostitution is already very underground. It intersects with other forms of abuse and violence. And just a reminder that we survivors, we are called survivors because there is a high risk of death when you are engaged in prostitution. And every single person who is engaged in prostitution are on high risk of trafficking and are on high risk of death. This is just a reminder that this is a reality. What we talk about human trafficking, we don't talk enough. This is a deeper issue. A lot of times we don't know about the victims. Even myself, when I was being trafficked, I was hearing names and I was like, where they are? Is that going to happen to me? And this is the reality that people in prostitution are facing, violence, abuse, and not receiving the support. Why? Because I think that a lot of times the services that we provide, we want just to feel the legal definition of human trafficking. And I know that there are a lot of constrictions about it, especially around budget, but it's we need to start moving from that direction and really offer services for all those who are in prostitution because that's a high indicator of trafficking. So let's start, now that we go about it, do you want to share some facts about the sex trade?
Yeah, so I think I jumped the gun a little bit and started explaining this in the last slide, but again, we see that this is a $1 billion worldwide industry. we see that while that is true, the vast majority, again, of the people who are being prostituted are living in poverty and have lived in poverty pretty much their whole lives. We see that the average age of entry is anywhere from 11 to 15 years old, with a frequently cited age of 13 years old. Again, with most people who are in prostitution having an extensive history of child abuse. We also see that 41,000 people contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline every year. We see that 72% of detected trafficking victims are women and girls. And again, to expand on Christian's point of the dangers of prostitution, we see that prostituted women are anywhere from 10 to 40 times higher risk of mortality rate, higher risk of early death and death by violence than the average population. We see that the majority of deaths in prostituted women that occur at an early age do occur due to direct violence from the sex buyers and from the traffickers.
Yes, one important thing about the sex trade, and especially about trafficking, is that not all trafficking cases all the time involve a pimp or openly a pimp who is like, you can identify. A lot of times this happens. One of the main things that we don't talk about is how familial trafficking can be happening through generations and it gets normalized. So that's important about getting all these trainings about trafficking, not only about policy and legislation, but really going beyond and really engaging survivors in this conversation. Because we have been through, we know how it looks like, and we know how to close this gap. So in the legal world, there are like 4 ways to address prostitution. The first one is full criminalization. That is, I think that is the model that is more famous. It's a model that we have in most of the states, except Nevada. So what is the meaning of full criminalization? Full criminalization means that the third parts that we have, the sex buyers, the pimps and brothel owners, and the people who is being bought and sold, they are criminalized because prostitution is considered a crime. We are not considering that trafficking is a crime. We don't consider why people enter the sex trade or prostitution. We don't care about like victims. We don't care about creating exit services. We don't care about all the people who are exploited. And this is a model that we have implemented in around the United States. So a lot of times people don't know about it, but the reality is that even here in the United States, under this model, the only ones who get arrested is the people who are being bought and sold. The people who are walking on the streets, and police think, actually in New York State, we have a law called walking while trans. People was able to stop you and put you in jail just by the way that you were dressed. If there was a suspicion of that you were engaged in prostitution or offering services, you can go to jail just like that. So this of course create big problems because now, especially what's targeting women, transgender women, and the LGBTQ plus community, because just by the way that we were dressing, it was assumed that we were committing a crime. So this is not only happening in your state, this is happening in other states. We don't talk about it, and this is the model that we have. The reality is that we need to move away from this under full criminalization. The idea of helping survivors of sex trafficking is that the only way that we can help them is getting them arrested. The only way that we can support them is getting them to courts and referring them to services. And we're ignoring how this is re-traumatizing the victims. This is putting them in systems that it's not going to be helpful. Probably that they are going to have charges of this, and this is going to affect their future. The second model is legalization. So legalization is totally the opposite of full criminalization. So now the 3 parts are legal. So literally it's like saying, well, now we don't care about people really, and people are commodities. I think that this is against our beliefs. And it's like, well, you can put a brothel and you can recruit people, and this is going to be totally legal. We just need you to pay taxes, and the regulations, to be honest, we don't really care. This is real. This is implemented already on Denmark, Australia, Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom. One of the big impacts of legalization is, of course, the increase of sex trafficking. There's a lot of resources that shows that legalization and full criminalization, that I'm going to talk Later, it's that they have very similar effects, and it's very important like to see how these countries are doing, because the reality is that yesterday one of our presenters was talking about Ukraine. In Germany, once the women were fleeing from Ukraine to Germany, instead of saying like, oh, we can offer you services, we can offer you food, housing, they were openly inviting them, like, come and work in a brothel. Like, we don't care about your trauma, we don't care about like what are you doing, like the best thing that you can do is sell your body. And I think that this is really something that is happening in front of us. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's really going deeper, like what is really happening. Like this is actually like trafficking. Like we see the power and control, we see how they are immigrant people, like looking for services, resources, escaping traumatic events, and the best that we can offer them is like to commodify them. I think that that's not the answer. Full decriminalization, it's very interesting, it's very connected with legalization, because legalization is like, well, I don't care where you are all commodities. I feel that full decriminalization is like, well, I'm beyond, like I really don't care about your human rights. Like people can do whatever they want. Now prostitution is not a crime. You can recruit people, you can sell people, like, and this, of course, like diminish the incentive of police to go around sex trafficking, because now the assumption is like everyone in prostitution is there by choice. Everyone in prostitution is there because it's empowering. And the reality is that within time, full decriminalization became legalization, because it needs to be regulated at least as a state level or a city level, like because it's monetary gain. So at the end, what is happening is that it really moves towards legalization, because it needs to be regulated, maybe not at a federal level, but at a city or a state level. And we're in the quality model, the model that I support openly, also known as the Nordic model, the partial decriminalization model. And this is very interesting, because I believe that prostitution and sex trafficking, it's not an easy concept, it's not an easy issue, it's extremely complex problem that we have. So it's interesting because the equality model is also a very complex solution. So instead of like going to the extremes of like, oh, legalizing or full decriminalization, is like, okay, so what do we need to do? And the equality model is taking the three parts. It's like, okay, we know that sex buyers are the ones committing abuse and violence towards our communities. They are the ones fostering prostitution. They are the demand for sex trafficking. And we know that the ones who are facilitating and creating these spaces where sex trafficking is happening is the brothel owners, the pimps. And so what do we need to do with them? Oh, we need to keep them accountable. So we are going to continue criminalizing them. Because if we legalize this part, or if we decriminalize this part, sex trafficking is going to increase, and we are going to continue fostering abuse and violence. But now what we do with the people who is being brought unsolved? What do we do with all these people that, regardless how they identify, they are on the sex trade? Well, we decriminalize them, because we have seen that under full criminalization, we have been targeting them. We have been targeting and putting in jail all the people who really need services, support, regardless how they self-identify. So this is the equality model. Just on the legal approach, is really continue criminalizing sex buyers, brothel owners, pimping, and start with the decriminalization of the people who is being bought and sold. Regardless how you enter the sex trade, the reality is that I want to support you. You deserve exit, the strategy, you deserve support, and this includes medical, mental health, housing, food, legal resources. And this is really accompanied with another part that is really educating people about removing the stigma of prostitution. People is not less, worse or better than anyone just because they are in prostitution. That's the reality. And every single time that you met someone who is in prostitution, don't think about I need to save them. The reality is that there's a story, and you need to meet the people where they are. So that's really why I'm advocating for the equality model, because it really give that opportunity of meeting people where they are. Do you want to add something else?
Yeah. So to expand on each of these, starting back with criminalization. So both criminalization and legalization / full decriminalization, which as Christian stated are very similar methods, which I'll be addressing as essentially the same method. So both full criminalization and full decriminalization rests upon that preconceived notion that prostitution and trafficking are different things, and that people that are involved in prostitution are choosing to be a part of that. And we've already reviewed how that is an extremely faulty and inhumane way of looking at this issue. What we also see in criminalization, as Christian stated, is that the victims here are not identified as victims, so they are treated as criminals. They are treated as doing something wrong in the exact same way that men who are buying and selling women for sex are doing, which again, we have reviewed is just a completely faulty understanding. And while we'd like to recognize the law enforcement that do care about this issue, that are coming and being educated by survivors that do want to discuss these things, I hope that we can all acknowledge that that is not the vast majority of law enforcement that interact with survivors or victims in that moment. A result of a study in Baltimore, Maryland, and that of course is a more liberal place, we could think that they might have more reforms for their law enforcement than other places. But even in Baltimore, Maryland, in a study over a year in 2017, found that 78% of prostituted women reported lifetime abusive police encounters that they suffered while they were in prostitution. We see that 41% of them reported daily or weekly encounters of any type. And that number is significant because if almost half of prostituted women are interacting with police on a daily or weekly basis, why are they not receiving assistance? And that is a result of the criminalization method of addressing prostitution. We see that 22% experienced client-perpetrated violence that was never addressed by police, even if they chose to go to the police. We see that more marginalized people within prostitution, so again, specifically citing here women that are living in poverty and that women that are suffering from substance use disorders experienced even greater violence from the police and even greater violence from clients. We see a direct correlation between prostituted women who regularly interact with police and law enforcement but are not giving exit resources and an increase in those women suffering from client-perpetrated violence. So again, there's a direct correlation in this study specifically with women who are regularly interacting with the police and women that are regularly experiencing even greater levels of violence from sex buyers. We see that frequent exposures to abusive police practices appear to directly contribute to an environment where women don't feel that they can exit the industry and that they have to suffer even greater forms of abuse from sex buyers and from pimps. And to offer a more personal understanding of this as well. That is part of my experience as a survivor, in which I was a victim of sex trafficking from the ages of 10 to 14. And I remember very clearly one of the times that an area that I was in, a home that I was in, was raided by the police. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, my whole life I've been told, police are the greatest people in the world and they're here to protect you, they're here to serve you. But my experience on that day was one police officer assaulting me while another one made sure that nobody else came into the room, and then they left, made a couple arrests for drug possession, and that was the end of that. And then I experienced trafficking for several more years after that. So again, while we recognize and we thank the law enforcement who are choosing to be a part of this conversation, vast majority of the reason that criminalization doesn't work is because the majority of the law enforcement are not behaving in that way. When we move into full decriminalization / legalization, this is an issue that we'll be talking a bit more in depth about in this presentation because of its recent popularity. It has really risen, especially among younger people, this idea of an empowerment narrative, of a quote-unquote sex work narrative, that prostitution can actually be a good thing. And one of the best case studies on the results of decriminalization comes from Amsterdam, and they implemented full decriminalization in the year 2000. And what we see is that there is an estimated that 50 to 90% of the women that are working or being trafficked more literally in legal brothels. So again, places to buy and sell sex that are recognized by Amsterdam's government. We see that 50 to 90% of the women in those brothels are victims of trafficking and have arrived there due to trafficking. We see that it actually makes it more difficult to either identify, acknowledge, or address trafficking of any kind, because now we see that traffickers and sex buyers are recognized just as business people that pay taxes, that are part of the community and the economy, just like somebody who works at like a mom and pop shop. They receive the same recognition and respect from the government as any other sort of person who sells an object. And this makes it more difficult to help any victims to address any sort of trafficking that is occurring, and to identify any sort of difference between somebody who may be there because they want to be, that does, while that is very rare, it does happen, and somebody who is not. We see a specific case in Amsterdam in which one police officer, after investigating a murder of a prostituted woman, he experienced a change of mind on what prostitution is and attempted to investigate the murder further and discuss whether full decriminalization is a good thing with his coworkers, and was fired and blacklisted due to that. Because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We know that the money is the motive, and that means if prostitution is considered a legitimate business and it's bringing in a ridiculous amount of money to communities, the government is going to want to protect it and protect the people doing it, regardless of the violence that is occurring behind closed doors. And then when we move into the Nordic model, I apologize. The Nordic model is what I have always referred to it as, and I know that Christian knows it as the equality model. It is one of the unfortunate things that it has so many different names. So the equality model rests on 4 understandings. One, that prostitution in and of itself is a form against violence against women, majorly, but also anybody who is involved. It is a phenomenon that is not fixed, of which the prevalence can change through time. And that's important, especially when you hear the argument of the oldest profession. We have to understand that prostitution is not just an inherent reality of our life as humans. We frankly just need to believe it better than that. We understand that it is a system which helps maintain violence against women, including women that are not a part of the sex industry. We do see in places with full decriminalization that violence, specifically sexual violence against women who are not a part of the sex industry at all, still increases in the same way that violence against women in the sex industry increases when there is full decriminalization. And then we understand that it is a signal that it is acceptable that a subset of women are sacrificed and can be bought and sold. So then again, from even a more theoretical feminist standpoint, we must understand that to make prostitution an acceptable thing means to essentially label all women and girls as commodities that can be bought if you have a high enough price. So one of the best case studies for the quality model and how it works is in Sweden. And that came into law in Sweden in 1999. It's the first attempt by a country to really, they were the first one, so that's also why it's frequently called the Swedish model, to address the root cause of prostitution and trafficking, the demand, the men who assume the right to purchase women and girls. And it's a cornerstone of Swedish efforts to create like a contemporary democratic society where women and girls can live lives free of all forms of male violence. In combination with public education, awareness-raising campaigns, and victim support, the law and other legislation established a zero-tolerance policy for prostitution and trafficking in human beings. And that review really comes from, I'm so sorry, I'm not going to be able to pronounce the Swedish name, but Gunilla Ekberg, who is the Swedish government's legal expert on trafficking and prostitution. And what we see in research done on Sweden since they have implemented the equality model is that trafficking has been reduced significantly. We see that it also reduces significantly the violence that women who are not involved in the sex industry at all suffer from. We see that rapes just in general fall significantly. Domestic violence in general falls significantly. And that it significantly increases arrests and convictions for sex buyers and for traffickers. We also see a significant increase in the number of victims who are willing to seek out the support of professionals that are willing, that feel safe and comfortable to say, yes, I am experiencing something, I am the victim of something, and I need help. And this does create an environment in which they feel comfortable to do that. Another thing that Cristian and I have found extremely important and absolute vital part of this presentation is that the equality model cannot exist in any successful way without an extremely well-funded, well-researched, survivor-oriented, holistic understanding of exit support. It's not enough just to arrest traffickers and sex buyers. We need to provide victims with housing, with substance use disorder and mental health treatment, with legal support such as expungement for previous records, assistance, regaining child custody. We need to provide them with trauma care, trauma-informed therapy, social workers. We need to have this, otherwise we are just going to perpetrate the same cycle that put them in the sex industry to begin with. So if you recall at the very beginning, we reviewed how do women end up in the sex industry. It's poverty, it's a history of abuse, it's addiction, it's mental health concerns, it's having no other way to really feel like you can live your life free of violence, to not even know what that looks like. And so the necessity of the exit programming with the Nordic model or the equality model it just can't be overstated. It has to occur in order to work. And again, the equality model also needs to rest more on the services of social workers, community organizers, and other involved persons who are not in law enforcement because of, as we reviewed, the high levels of law enforcement continuing, perpetrating, supporting violence against victims. Frankly, we need to have an understanding of that again, that this needs to be exit support provided by people who are not wearing badges and carrying guns. It just can't be. And these things are just, again, cannot be overstated how important that is for this model to work.
Oh, perfect. It's just what we were covering about. The reality is that the equality model is already trying to be implemented in the United States. Maine, Massachusetts, Louisiana, and New York State have tried to they draft state legislation, and it's very important something else. There have been also full decriminalization legislation that have been drafted, and we have some states as Washington. This was 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago. I went testify because full decriminalization bill was introduced and had a lot of supporters. So survivors were over there and went to explain to the judicial committee like why it was not okay to pass a full decriminalization bill. This has been replicated in different states. New York State is one of those that exists a legislation about full decriminalization. But also in New York State we have an equality model legislation. So if we want to really contribute with this, we really need to start engaging in more advocacy to really understand what is happening. Keep an eye on those states that draft full decriminalization bills. What is happening on the national landscape is that the full decriminalization movement tried to do first with Washington legislation. If that legislation passed in Washington, it was going to be a domino effect to all the other states. There was going not to be resistance, and that is one of the main concerns for survivors. If one full decriminalization bill is passed in any state, it's going to happen the same with all of the other states. We should be concerned? Yes, we should be very concerned about this. if already we don't have budget for human trafficking, forget about it if this happens. What is happening is that there has been national efforts to combat or prevent the implementation of full decriminalization bills. And now, instead of trying to draft state legislation, they are doing local legislation. So I know that there are people from different states. I really invite you to keep an eye about human trafficking and prostitution bills that are being put on legislation, because a lot of times they don't say it to the public. Even in New York, we didn't know until they introduced the bill, and it was like 1 week before they introduced it, and we were like, how this is happening, and we didn't know. So engage, talk with your senators, with your congresspeople, with your city council. It's very, very important that we educate all our political representatives, because now full decriminalization movement is moving to local spaces. So because it's easier to pass a bill or a legislation on a local stance than on a state or a federal stance. So it's very, very, very important. And again, highlighting that if we are going to fight against trafficking, we need to start building coalition with services that provide housing, food, low-income immigration services, and all these things, because if we don't offer exit strategies, services, and support, any model is not going to work.
So again, just to expand, since that last slide covered resource and exit support again, just to expand on that a little further with a specific instance. New Zealand is another country which has the full decrim/legalization model. And there is a case study there that occurred where a woman was seeking out the government support comparable to our unemployment, food stamps, that sort of thing, New Zealand's version of that, due to not having any income whatsoever and therefore not being able to support herself or her family. And due to the fact that prostitution there is considered a job just like any other, she was actually denied benefits because the government told her, you have not looked through all of your options. You have not tried every job because you have not tried being a prostitute, and therefore we will not give you government benefits. And that is a clear example of the direct results that all women and girls will suffer as prostitution becomes more normalized. And I'm sure there's much more than that. That is the specific case study that I'm familiar with. And then I really just want to drive home Christian's point about the importance of being aware of this legislation. So as stated, as Teresa shared, I am from Ohio. And not too long ago, there was a local level legislation. I'm very close to the Michigan border, if any of you are familiar with that side of the Midwest. And I live about 30, 40 minutes from an area called Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is home of the University of Michigan. It's a really cute, small town, extremely affluent, well known to be like a hippie art scene. I go there all the time, it's just fun. And Teresa had texted me and said, hey, did you hear about this? And sent me a link that very quietly a local level politician in Ann Arbor was pushing for full decriminalization on a local level in Ann Arbor. And we were able to rally a good number of survivors and people like many of you in this room who support survivors and listen to us, so thank you for that. But we were able to rally enough people, to reach out and say, write letters. There were people who lived in Ann Arbor were, having protests. Like, we were showing action, and again, really relying on survivors, by and large, are the people most often, most visibly, most vocally pushing for the equality model and not criminalization and not decriminalization. And essentially we were just told, who cares? They didn't care about what we had to say. They didn't want to hear any of it. And as Christian also stated, our legal system here in the US relies so frequently and so heavily on precedent. And so as these things pass in local level legislation, it's just going to grow further into state level, and I really believe that the consequences of decriminalization and legalization of prostitution, if they were to occur on a more mass scale in any place, but especially focusing here on the US, as that's where we are, I just don't believe that the consequences of that for women and girls can be overstated. We need to understand that. And we really need to be willing to be direct on the ground, especially if you are not a survivor. You have the ability to talk about these things with significantly less trauma and danger than we do as survivors. And if you are somebody who is claiming to care about, anti-trafficking as an issue, claiming to support survivors, listen to us when we are asking you to do something that can tangibly support us, which is to be vocal about, the equality model. Be willing to have conversations with people in your life of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just call that woman a prostitute or just like make fun of her because she's standing on the side of the road, and like let's talk about what actually might be happening in her life, and let's talk about what these things actually look like and how can we support survivors that are going through this, or victims that are currently going through this. I have another example, which is there is a state politician in Ohio that I had previously worked with. She had asked me for some consulting on, anti-trafficking information, assessments of that sort. Happy to assist, of course. And then when I reached out to her with a request, which is, can we talk about the possibility of proposing some sort of equality model legislation in Ohio? The response that I received was essentially, that'll never pass. That's, too difficult. That'll damage, my, ability to re-election, that sort of thing. And again, this was somebody who had used my services, as a survivor to assist with things when she needed it. When I said, hey, here's how you can really help survivors even more than you already are, it was brushed off. And my response to that is, again, what I'll say to all of you, which is, it's a lot harder than hard conversations. It's a lot harder than advocating for an unpopular legal model, such as the equality model. Living through prostitution, that's a lot harder. Living through trafficking, that's a lot harder. So frankly, I just don't have a lot of concern about whether these conversations are uncomfortable for people or if they don't want to be controversial, because if you care about this issue and you want to support survivors, we're telling you directly on a stage with microphones, here's how you can do it.
Yes, no, I just want to highlight that some of the states that have tried to implement full decriminalization bills have been New York State, Louisiana, Vermont, New Hampshire. So just keep an eye, really reach out to all your local survivors, local organizations to really go through it. I'm saying that we have concentration of time, so this is really what the equality model bill does in New York, super quick. Decriminalizes people in prostitution, the expand of social services. And a lot of times I hear that people is like, well, this is going to be very hard because of budget restrictions, because of legal definitions. The reality is that in New York City specifically, we have a health clinic that is called the Empower Center that provides services to people in the sex trade regardless how they self-identify. They don't need to identify as survivors. They don't need to say like, I'm suffering from abuse and violence. Just by the fact that they are in prostitution or in the sex trade, they can receive free services here. So this is possible. We can do it in all cities, and these are the changes that we need. With no stigma, really funding and focusing on supporting the people regardless how they self-identify. Some other things is that the strongest laws against trafficking. One big thing, and I cannot read it from here, but it's interesting that even in New York, this was very interesting. If a sex buyer near a school zone was buying a commercial sex act, one of the things that he could protect himself was like, oh, I didn't know that it was a minor. And it was fine. And it was totally fine. How that could be fine? So the equality model is looking also to closing these gaps. Protection of children against exploitation, violence from children on 11, 16, or in a school zone, that's not allowed anymore. Like if you purchase sex from a minor, that's sex trafficking immediately. And this was a way for sex buyers to prey upon children. Like how you are not going to know that it's a children on a school zone, and how our legal system was allowing that to happen. So I will also encourage you to read about human trafficking legislation in your states. A lot of times we think that we are doing really great, but a lot of times that's not the case. And really advances criminal justice reform. One of the main things that we are very concerned, especially in New York State, about the equality model, it was like, okay, we want the police law enforcement to keep accountable sex buyers and pimps. But we know that New York State have a lot of communities. So we were very concerned about increasing the criminalization of people of color, of black people. So in the part of the sex buyers in our bill, there is a slight scale fee. So the people, based on your income, the sex buyers receive the fee that they need, like to. A lot of times the judge need to choose between sending them to jail or like paying, and the amount that they are paying it's based on income, because we also recognize we don't live like in a perfect world, but a lot of sex buyers are part of our communities, and we really need to target those sex buyers with more power, with more money, those who are like really driving this. So as I saying, the equality model is really a complex solution. It really needs to be tailored for each state, listening to survivors, and to really doing an analysis of existing human trafficking laws in each state. So that's all. Yes.
So just in the final closing, I know we want to respect your time. We also got started a little bit late. So just our finale here is, as stated, we are asking you to have these conversations. We are asking you to support equality model, Nordic model, legislation, and hopefully we can all consolidate into one name. That would be great. But we want to give you tools to do that, and that's really what this whole presentation has been about. So just in the last minute here, I'm going to review just some common things that you might hear as you have these conversations with people in your life. So first is vocabulary. We really want to get into what kind of language we should be using. One thing that's commonly used by people who are in support of full decriminalization or legalization is the term sex work. We don't want to use that or the term sex worker because, again, prostitution is not a job like any other. It is not the same as working at Walmart. And I'm not saying working at Walmart is great, but it's sure a hell of a lot better than having to have sex with strangers, and often violent strangers, in order to survive. It is just not the same as regular employment. Sex work as a label also completely destroys any sort of distinction in the sex industry, which is important. Because while everything in the sex industry is objectifying, and while it is all dehumanizing, while it is all misogynistic, and it is all extremely likely to be violent, there is a strong difference between somebody who is perhaps selling some nude photos of themselves online from the safety of their home, and somebody who is, again, on the street having sex for survival with random people, all day long that they do not know. And the term sex work does not acknowledge any difference between those things and just lumps it all into one vague category. We also don't really use the term prostitutes because that is, while it is more accurate to what the sex industry is and doesn't really mince words about what happens, it's dehumanizing. So I know for myself personally, I use the term prostituted women. And there it acknowledges both the reality of prostitution and doesn't try to sugarcoat what it is, but doesn't dehumanize and just refer to them as prostitutes. And then just really quick, a couple really frequent myths that we hear, especially in regard to preferring decriminalization, legalization, as we reviewed at the beginning, is at this point in time the most popular legal model that people are seeking. So some myths that you might hear against the equality model in favor of decriminalization. Doesn't legal prostitution help reduce violence against women? Well, one, as we reviewed earlier, no person should ever be considered as disposable. As in, yeah, don't assault this, nice middle-class suburban woman when you can go pay this woman who I don't think matters as a human being and insult her instead. So on a theoretical level, that doesn't make sense because it just is dehumanizing to a population, puts certain women and girls as disposable, which we don't want to do. And then secondly, there is not one single piece of research, hear me when I say this, not one that supports that decriminalization decreases violence in any way. It all shows that it increases violence both against women in the sex industry and women outside of it. Prostitution is the oldest profession. Let's say oldest oppression instead, please. And again, it's not a job like any other. It just isn't. There's nothing that is similar about being in the sex industry and being, an employee literally anywhere else. I can't even think of an example because I'm like, any job is different than being in the sex industry. And of course, we also know we've always done it this way. It's just not a good argument for anything. You know, for the vast majority of human history, women weren't considered people in any regard. Couldn't read, couldn't go to school, you know, couldn't choose to be single, couldn't choose not to have children, you know, couldn't have jobs. And why would we want to keep doing things that way? It's just not a good argument. And we see the argument, again, often used with that label, sex work, empowerment and autonomy. Can't this be empowering for people? Can't people choose to do this? Empowerment is just a poor model of understanding any issue because it's so subjective. You could say that anything is empowering. If that's the standard, then what's stopping me from saying that me killing people is empowering to me? Like, you know, you could have serial killers saying that. It just doesn't make sense logically. But also it's a very flimsy approach because empowerment in a true feminist understanding should be about education, resources, and tangible self-determination, legal rights, human rights, autonomy, and those things do not come from prostitution, as we have reviewed in this whole presentation. And it should, autonomy as it feels good to me, again, just a very flimsy approach. We also see that many of the organizations and like public PR lobbies in favor of sex work, if you really get into some investigative journalism, you see that many of these organizations, even if they're under different names, are run and funded by the same like groups of men who like own OnlyFans, who own Pornhub, who own all of these websites. They are directly funneling money into this understanding of sex work as empowering because they know it makes their lives easier, it makes people less likely to come after what they do. And just a side note, you know, as the Christian and I is in favor of the equality model, we do consider, you know, pornography, stripping, all aspects of the sex industry to be directly related and within trafficking. Just put that out there also. And then lastly, or two more, doesn't criminalization push it underground? Christian addressed that. Frankly, there's no secret door to go knock on to access to a woman who is in prostitution. That's not how it works. Pimps want money and sex buyers want to purchase women. They know how to find each other and they will no matter what. And the research does show, again, as I covered earlier, that actually full decriminalization does do more to push it underground because then you have legal brothels that are there and are just allowed to be there, but they're never investigated, they're never messed with, they're just left alone because they're legal. So in that way, it's more underground under full decriminalizations. It allows pimps to operate, you know, fully legal brothels undisturbed by governments. And then truly lastly, there's arguments that the equality model might hurt the most vulnerable people within prostitution, such as people of color, LGBT victims, people suffering from substance use and mental health concerns. And that we reviewed, that could happen, but it won't if there is the exit support, if there is the understanding that this is not about law enforcement, this is about supporting victims and survivors. And if you take one thing from our presentation today, let it be that the equality model is most vocally supported by survivors because that's the whole point, is to support victims and survivors. That is the end of our presentation. If we would be happy to stay for Q&A if other people are, if we're allowed to, I guess.
And I just want to also mention that the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking have taken an official stance on the equality model, and that is what we support. So, if you guys have any questions, feel free to walk up to the microphone. We have a few minutes here that we can ask them some great questions. They did a fantastic job.
Thank you so much, Christian and Kylie, for your leadership in the anti-exploitation movement, for this incredible presentation. Thank you for emphasizing the language. I think that's a huge issue, and then really honing in on the evidence right supporting the equality model and the evidence showing that full decriminalization and legalization actually cause more harms, and that there is no evidence, I will also repeat it, to show that full decriminalization actually helps women. In an earlier session, we actually heard a speaker seemingly support the full decriminalization as a model, citing that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have supported it, Black Lives Matter movement has come out in support. I'd love to hear your take on that. Why is that? I know it's often cited, and I think a lot of well-meaning people do hear that empowerment language and see, are hearing those saying that it is something that they're choosing. Why do you think that these institutions that do very good work, meaningful work, have bought into the full decrim position?
I'm gonna start.
I got some of that.
First is the politics of identities, because the sexual movement, it looks like it's promoted from the LGBTQ plus community, especially transgender women. People are afraid to say like, oh, well, I cannot get in opposition because like that's going to make me a transphobic person. Well, that's not true, to be honest. The reality is that prostitution is not an only LGBTQ plus issue. It's really a human rights issue. That's the first part that we just need to, we cannot categorize like, oh, prostitution is only an LGBTQ plus issue. Most of the organizations that have a stance like that, it's because you are going to see it if you start paying attention. Their speakers are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and it's because the politics or identity. Like, I cannot be in opposition if someone is more vulnerable or their identities are more vulnerable than mine. So the first part is that, and the second part is that, can you touch a little bit on this? There are a lot of organizations that now are giving a lot of funding, but it's very interesting. If you say, I want funding for human trafficking or people in the sex trade, you don't get that funding. But if you say, I'm going to do research, create support groups, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to do, but you put sex work, you get the funding. And this is happening on the private sector. And sadly, the federal, the government is taking the stance. We have been fighting a lot because in a lot of human trafficking report, they have been using sex work. Every single time that a trafficking report coming from government is coming and it uses sex work, we have been fighting extremely hard because it's really doing that. So they can funnel also funding. So it's very, very important like to see this, who is behind this money, and that don't be afraid like to really stand, talk about the equality model. That doesn't make you homophobic, transphobic, that doesn't make you misogynistic, that doesn't make you, the reality is that it's a very complex analysis. I think that that's why I really love the equality model, because it's challenging people. But I will something else that.
Yeah, so really just seconding what you've both said, that it is a lot of well-meaning people that fall into this idea of sex work, full decriminalization, legalization, and I really want to drive that home, that I think the vast majority of people that support these things do so because they believe it is the genuinely best way to support their fellow human being. They fall into, you hear empowerment, that's a great buzzword, let's just be honest. You hear empowerment, yeah, I'm in favor of empowerment, and if somebody is telling you, especially somebody part of a campaign that's very well funded, is telling you over and over again, this is empowering, well, of course, you're gonna be like, sure, yeah, I support that. And I also really want to entirely back up what Cristian said. I do believe that this is an issue just more reflective of the way that we approach difficult issues, controversial issues, political issues as a whole in this current time. Not that we've maybe ever really addressed them better. I don't know if I'd go that far in the past, you know, but now it's a different sort of issue, which is that the only qualification that you need a lot of times to talk about something is some sort of identity label, as Cristian was getting into identity politics. And that is why it was really important for me to express to you all that Cristian and I are survivors. We are LGBT people. I am, you know, in my own personal recovery from addiction. You know, we do have these understandings. We both grew up in poverty. We know what that's like. But also, you know, Cristian is a part of this legal team. I am a licensed social worker. We have done this research. Like truthfully shouldn't listen to us just because we say we're X, Y, Z. You need to have the research to back you up. And so many people don't because they know they don't have to. They know they can just say, I'm, the most marginalized person in the room, listen to me. And there is a lot to be said, of course, about lived experience experts, but you need to have more than that. You need to have the research, and people don't want to get into these difficult issues. They don't want to be labeled as, X, Y, Z sort of, bigot or whatever else. And they also, I think a lot of people just don't want to do the research, don't want to take the time to read into it. And all of those things combined into a very well-meaning but very lazy analysis. And that's where I think you get such hard level support for the sex work full decriminalization is, again, just well-meaning but very lazy analysis. And so I'm backing up Christian again, part of the reason I love talking about this so much is because of how much other people don't want to listen to me talk about it. And it's, that's how you know you're really doing something. If people are like, get this woman off the stage.
Something similar, and this is something that I read a few months ago and then now very relevant, that there's a few organizations out there that are created by people that are women that are in the prostitution sector, and they actually have created their own organizations to help provide themselves with legal services, health services, and seem to promote and want the decriminalization model. What are your thoughts on that? And I think there's two. There's the Desiree Alliance and the Sex Workers Project.
So I want to start by saying that, again, from both a survivor perspective and also a social work perspective, there is nothing in this world that I love more than harm reduction. I am all in favor of all types of harm reduction, for all people in all walks of life. You got free STI testing, free condoms, needle exchanges, fentanyl test strips, Narcan, all of whatever you can label as harm reduction, I'm in favor of it. What I do not agree with, from just speaking for myself here, is to give Christian an ability to answer as well, but for myself, I don't agree with harm reduction that comes with the follow-up of, and let's decriminalize this, and yes, this is good. You can say we should make this safer for the people that are living through it without saying, and also I think this thing is good. And I do want to compare it further to substance use, because I am in full favor, again, of free Narcan, education, fentanyl test strips, all of those things. I have benefited from those things directly in my lived experience. But I would never follow that up with, and using heroin is totally normal and fine, and let's support it, and let's make it more accessible. That would almost destroy the point of harm reduction. But to get further into why I think those people are approaching it that way, this is one of those issues, like we said, it's controversial, it's hard to talk about, and at the end of the day, survivors, we're not a monolith. We are going to disagree with each other, and that's all right. There are going to be people who have lived experiences like I do, like Christian does, and we may not ever agree with each other. And I think that there is just a certain level of that will always be that way.
Yeah, I would say that actually this is a perfect example that how we think we are very good, but actually this shows how we have been excluding certain people that doesn't follow under our understanding of trafficking or exploitation, and we haven't given them services. So this need created, forced them create a community where they were not going to be stigmatized, where they were going to receive services without seeing people who have the complex savior, without being discriminated or being told why are you doing this, why you didn't escape, this is the best that you can do. This is the reality that a lot of times, even if we are giving services, we are not doing enough. And the other part is that the reality, if you, and I really, yes, people who talk about the quality model will complicate this, to be honest. But if we are going to talk about harm reduction, actually the quality model is a harm reduction approach to reduce sex trafficking. So just keep that in mind.
And I'll follow that up to the sex workers, it's what called SWAP. We had conversations with them and asked them, and you have to remember, human trafficking is based on manipulation and coercion, right? We can all agree that's the foundation of it. we asked the sex workers, at what age were you first, did you first engage in sex for exchange for something? And they said, we said, was it under the age of 18? And they said, definitely, probably 100%. So, of sex workers who are doing it by choice, were actually trafficked as children. And so they, in my opinion, haven't recovered and gotten the proper healing to see that that was, what they think now is a choice that they're making was because they were coerced and they haven't healed from that. I hope that makes sense.
Yes,
So,
thank you.
Okay, last one.
Yeah, so I just have a question. It's more about strategy, I guess. So for those of us who want to try to implement this and advocate for this within our own state, I'm hearing you say that it's not just about law enforcement and we have to have the exit strategies first, right? So I am actually the executive director for an emergency crisis shelter for victims of human trafficking. Thank you. But I also serve on the Oklahoma Coalition Against Trafficking with my friends back here. And so we have opportunity to speak into legislation and law enforcement, have rapport with our local law enforcement department. But I'm wondering if we only have a certain amount of time and energy and resources, would you say we put it into expanding capacity of services first? Or would you say, because if we bring this legislation to market, so to speak, early, could it be harmful and backfire? I guess would be my question. Or would you say work on these things parallel? I'm just thinking strategically about how we can implement this well and not get the cart before the horse.
I would say that go with your anti-trafficking champions in your state. One of the big things that we have learned is that in New York State we put all together in one legislation. That is extremely hard to pass. What you can do is that, like, instead of creating one equality model bill, like, oh, okay, I'm going to create one bill that addresses that and one bill that increases services. So you can advocate separate for them, and if you are gaining territory, to be honest, like, because you are educating. One of the main things that we have seen about trying to implement the equality model first is like really educating politicians, law enforcement agencies around really why they should stop raiding, like really educating them about trafficking 101. I'm not kidding, law enforcement need really trafficking 101, especially around coercion, and really focusing on the part of buyers. Because most of states, law enforcement is really focused on the criminalization of the people with moral assault or the prosecuted person. And that's a great way to start moving the shift towards the equality model. So I would say that yes, if you are really interested, create these separate bills, because a lot of times when you put it in one bill, it's make it harder to pass.
Yeah, I think the immediate thing that I thought of was it shouldn't be just your organization alone handling this, and it may be.
It's not. We have a couple of others in our state as well.
Yeah, wonderful.
But not enough, obviously.
Absolutely, and I don't think anybody has enough. And as I stated, I'm a crisis social worker, so thank you. I know exactly what that's like, and I know what it's like to have a demand for services that is ridiculously higher than what you have available to give. And so I think what I immediately thought was it's coalition building. It's I talk about trafficking with the substance use harm reduction communities in my area. I've worked with the hospitals, the schools, our reproductive health care centers. Any place that you could possibly think a victim will benefit from this service, they should be a part of that. I also believe strongly that public education is one of the most vital pieces of this conversation. Talking about things I was so glad when I looked at the agenda and there were multiple things about pornography. I was like, thank you, we need to be talking about these things very publicly and very openly in a way that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think that will assist with the coalition building, that will assist with passing laws in a way that, like you said, will not end up jumping the gun and harming people. And then lastly, just to say, as I've stated, this is not a movement happening super visibly in Ohio, but I do have a good amount of legal experience, legislation experience with abortion rights. And one thing that we do in that community, the reproductive rights community, is sometimes it has to be the incremental approach of we solidify this right, and then we solidify that right, and we solidify that right, and then if we can, pass a bill, just like Christian said, sometimes putting one big bill all at once just you might put the cart before the horse, but also you might just not even get it passed at that point. So thank you for your question.
All right.
Thank you, Christian and Kay. I can't tell you how much we've all appreciated hearing from your wisdom. I am so excited that you're here for this week, this weekend. I just thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to close saying that we cannot normalize prostitution, regardless of the stance of everyone. And if one of us has a price, we all have a price. And this really expands to our loved ones. And sooner than later, if we normalize prostitution, our loved ones not only can be exploited, raped, but also they can experience it. So just start thinking about this, and this is an issue that is affecting all of us.
And I want to just add, lastly, that we have a document that has all of the cited research that we talked about today, as well as more research that, we could talk about this all night. So more research and as well as resources for domestic and international organizations in favor of the equality model and individual survivors who speak very publicly about the equality model. We have that document. I'm going to beef it up just a little bit more, and then I will be sending it to Teresa and Katie to distribute to all of you.
Perfect. Thank you.